I used to be Dr. Evelyn Hart, the woman who saved lives but didn't believe in miracles, a surgeon who scoffed at the idea of God while holding death itself in my hands every day. I was brilliant, logical, and utterly lost, so consumed by my work that I pushed away everyone I loved, convinced I was in control of my destiny. But that all changed the night my car careened off that icy road, and I found myself in a place no medical textbook could explain, a courtroom where my soul was on trial, and I came face to face with truths I had spent my whole life denying. The rain was relentless that night, pounding against my windshield as if trying to break through. I gripped the wheel tighter, my knuckles pale under the dim glow of the dashboard. I had driven this stretch of highway 1,000 times, but tonight, everything felt off. Maybe it was the fatigue from a double shift at the hospital, or maybe it was the gnawing guilt in my chest. I missed my daughter's birthday again. 12 years old, and I couldn't even show up for cake. I caught a glimpse of her face in my mind, the way she had looked up at me that morning, expectant, hopeful. "You'll come home early this time, right, Mom?" she'd said, clutching the locket I gave her last year. I nodded without thinking, too preoccupied with emails and rounds. Of course, I didn't make it. A ruptured aneurysm in the ER took precedence. That's what I told myself anyway. The truth was harder to swallow. My chest tightened, a twinge of something unfamiliar. Shame, maybe. It wasn't a feeling I was used to. I adjusted the rearview mirror, trying to shake it off, but the rain blurred the reflection of my eyes, hollow and tired. I hated seeing myself like this. The road curved sharply ahead, and my tires hit a patch of standing water. The car jerked violently to the side. My heart slammed against my ribs as I yanked the wheel, trying to regain control. The headlights swept across the trees, spinning wildly, and then everything went still. The sickening pause before impact. The crash was deafening. Metal screeched and crunched as the car plunged down the embankment. My body was thrown forward, the seatbelt biting into my chest. Glass shattered somewhere behind me. Then silence. I couldn't move. Pain radiated through every inch of me, sharp and unrelenting. I gasped for air, but it felt like I was inhaling fire. My hands fumbled at the door handle, but they were sluggish, weak. Blood trickled into my eyes from a cut on my forehead, blurring my vision. I tried to scream, but only a rasp escaped. My chest heaved once, twice, then nothing. It was as if a switch had been flipped. The pain was gone, replaced by an eerie, weightless sensation. I opened my eyes, or maybe I didn't. Everything was dark, but not empty. There was texture to it, a feeling like velvet stretched over an infinite expanse. And then I heard them, the voices. They started as whispers, barely audible, like the rustling of leaves. Then they grew louder, distinct, overlapping in a chaotic symphony. Some were familiar, others alien, but all of them were talking about me. She wasted so many chances. She was a healer, but forgot how to heal herself. Why didn't she see what was right in front of her? "Who's there?" I tried to shout, but my voice didn't make a sound. My body, or whatever I was now, drifted in the void, weightless, powerless. Panic gripped me, but the voices didn't stop. They swirled around me, relentless, accusing. And then came the light. It was sudden, blinding, and yet it didn't hurt. It pulled me forward, gentle but insistent, like an unseen hand guiding me. I tried to resist, to push back, but there was no use. I was being drawn in whether I wanted to go or not. The light grew, forming a space that was vast and incomprehensible. It wasn't a place, exactly, it felt more like a state of being. In the center of it stood something, a presence, immense and unyielding. It wasn't a person, but it wasn't an abstraction either. It simply was. A voice spoke, not aloud, but directly into my mind. It was neither male nor female, young nor old. It carried authority, but also a weight of sorrow. "Evelyn Hart, you stand in judgment." Judgment? My thoughts scrambled for footing. Wait, I'm a doctor. I save lives. I've done nothing wrong. The presence didn't respond, but suddenly, I wasn't alone. Another figure materialized beside me. At first, it looked like a shadow, a dark, indistinct shape that moved unnaturally, like smoke trapped in a bottle. Then it spoke, and its voice was unnervingly familiar. "I'm your advocate," it said, and I flinched at the sound. It was my voice, distorted, hollow. "I'm here to help you face the truth." "What truth?" I demanded, though my fear betrayed me. "The truth of your life," the advocate said, almost mockingly. "Of who you are, of what you've done, and what you've left undone." The space around us shifted, and suddenly I was standing in a hospital corridor. It was surreal, vivid, as if I were actually there. A younger version of myself hurried past, her white coat billowing behind her. She was focused, efficient, cold. I watched as the scene unfolded. A grieving family pleaded with me outside an ICU room. Their father was dying, and they begged me to call a chaplain. I dismissed them with a curt wave, muttering something about hospital protocol and how their father needed science, not prayer. "That wasn't my job," I said, almost defensively. "Wasn't it?" the advocate countered. "You had a choice. You always had a choice." The scene dissolved, replaced by another. This time, I was at my mother's bedside. Her face was pale, sunken, her hand outstretched toward me. She was asking for forgiveness, her voice weak, trembling. I stood frozen, my arms crossed, the bitterness of old wounds keeping me from reaching back. "Why?" the advocate asked. She left me," I stammered. "She chose her faith over her family." I couldn't. "She asked for grace," the advocate said, its tone sharper now. "You denied her." The memories came faster, each one sharper than the last. Missed opportunities, unspoken apologies, moments where I chose logic over compassion, distance over love. Each one hit me like a blow, and I realized with growing horror that I couldn't defend myself. The voices from the void returned, louder now, echoing the accusations. My heart, or whatever was left of it, felt like it was breaking. I wanted to scream, to plead my case, but I couldn't. And then the judge spoke again, its voice cutting through the chaos. "You are being shown these moments not for punishment, but for understanding. The weight of your choices must be felt before redemption can be sought." "Redemption?" I whispered, the word foreign on my lips. The light shifted again, and I felt a warmth I hadn't noticed before. It was faint, distant, but it was there. The advocate stiffened beside me, its shadow flickering unnaturally. "You can't go back," it hissed. "You're too far gone." But deep down, something stirred, a spark, faint but undeniable. For the first time, I wondered if I might be wrong. About everything. The space shifted again, and I was no longer floating in the void. I stood in what could only be described as a courtroom, though it bore no resemblance to any earthly one I had ever seen. The walls weren't walls at all. They seemed alive, pulsing faintly with golden light that shimmered like waves. The air was dense yet breathable, heavy with something I couldn't name, but felt deep in my bones. Before me was a colossal bench, though no judge or figure of authority sat upon it. The presence I had felt earlier lingered here, vast and overwhelming, though still unseen. My so-called advocate loomed to my left, its shadowy form shifting and twisting as if it struggled to maintain shape. It no longer resembled me exactly, but every now and then, the edges of its face would flicker into my own, distorted and hollow. I kept my distance, though I wasn't sure where I could go. On my right, the space stretched infinitely, a vast expanse of white mist that glowed faintly, comforting yet unattainable. The voices returned, this time forming a chorus that echoed throughout the chamber. I didn't need to be told who or what they were. I knew. They were the summation of my choices, my decisions, my failures, and my triumphs, though the triumphs felt scarce now. Each voice carried a weight that settled deep in my chest. "Evelyn Hart, your life is laid bare." The judge's voice boomed, the sound reverberating through me as though I were a bell struck by a hammer. It wasn't angry or cruel, but firm, impossible to ignore. Every choice, every action, every omission. Nothing is hidden here. I opened my mouth to speak, to plead my case, but no words came. The advocate stepped forward, its smoky form solidifying into something vaguely human like, though the eyes remained hollow voids. It spoke in a voice that was a cruel imitation of mine, sharp and bitter. Dr. Evelyn Hart. It said with a mocking emphasis on the title. A woman of reason, a savior of lives, a self made success. But what is success without compassion? What is reason without faith? Stop it. I managed to croak, my voice weak and unfamiliar in this place. I've done my best. I've saved people. I've worked harder than anyone. And yet, the advocate interrupted, its voice like a dagger. You stood unmoved while a family begged for hope. You turned away from a dying mother's outstretched hand. You abandoned your daughter in favor of accolades that meant nothing in the end. That's not fair, I shouted, though the sound barely echoed in the vast chamber. My hands curled into fists, though they felt powerless here. I've had to make choices, hard choices. I saved lives because that was my duty. I didn't have time for everything else. And in saving bodies, you neglected souls, the judge intoned, its voice striking deeper than any scalpel, including your own. The space around us shifted again, pulling me into a memory I had tried to forget. I was in the hospital, standing in a sterile, cold hallway. The walls were beige, the lighting fluorescent, and the air smelled faintly of antiseptic. I saw myself, calm, composed, detached, facing the young woman and her brother, their faces red and streaked with tears. Behind them was a room where their father lay, hooked up to machines, his body frail and broken. Please, the woman said, her voice trembling. Please, can you call someone? A chaplain, a priest, anyone who can pray with us? I saw myself shake my head, my expression one of practiced neutrality. I'm sorry, I heard my past self say. We don't bring spiritual figures into this process unless the patient requests it beforehand. Right now, he needs medical care, not superstitions. The woman's face crumpled, and her brother placed a hand on her shoulder, pulling her away. I remembered how I had walked off without a second glance, convincing myself that I had made the logical, professional choice. But standing here now, reliving it, I felt the weight of what I had done or failed to do. The memory dissolved, and I was back in a courtroom. My legs felt weak, but I forced myself to stay upright. I didn't mean to hurt them, I said, my voice trembling. I thought I was doing what was right. The advocate let out a laugh, cold and hollow. You thought of yourself first. You thought of your precious logic, your clean, ordered world where there was no room for anything messy or unquantifiable. You thought of control, Evelyn, and you held on to it until it became your God. Enough, the judge commanded, and the advocate fell silent. For a brief moment, I felt a flicker of relief, though it didn't last. Evelyn, do you understand the weight of what you've seen? I nodded, though my stomach churned. I, I think so. You do not, the judge said, its voice quieter now, though no less commanding. Not yet. The scene changed again, and I found myself in a small, dimly lit bedroom. The air was thick with the scent of antiseptic and lavender, my mother's favorite scent. She lay in a hospital bed, her body frail and her skin paper thin. Her hand reached out toward me, trembling slightly. Evelyn, she said, her voice barely above a whisper. Please, can we talk? Before it's too late. I remembered this moment vividly, the surge of anger and hurt that had risen in my chest at the time. She had abandoned me as a child, choosing her faith and her church over her own family. And now she wanted reconciliation? I had crossed my arms and stood frozen, my silence louder than any words could have been. Eventually, she had closed her eyes, her hand falling limp at her side. The memory lingered this time, refusing to dissolve like the others. I stood there, staring at my younger self, wanting to scream at her, shake her, make her see what she was doing. But it was too late. It had always been too late. She asked for grace, the advocate said, its voice soft but cutting. And you denied her, just as you have denied it for yourself. Tears burned in my eyes, and for the first time, I let them fall. I didn't know, I whispered. I didn't know how much it mattered. You chose not to know, the judge said. You chose not to see. The courtroom reformed around me, and I fell to my knees, the weight of everything pressing down on me. The advocate loomed closer, its shadow stretching over me. Do you see now? It hissed. Do you see the truth of who you are? I looked up at the judge, my voice trembling. Is there any way to fix it? The advocate's laughter echoed through the chamber, but the judge's presence grew brighter, silencing it. That, the judge said, is what you must decide. The silence that followed the judge's words was deafening. I knelt there in the vast courtroom, staring into the glowing expanse where the judge's presence seemed to radiate from. My chest heaved, though there was no air to catch. I had asked if there was a way to fix it, and now the crushing weight of that question hung over me. The advocate loomed just out of sight, its dark, swirling form waiting, expectant. I hated the way it made me feel, like prey under a predator's gaze. Suddenly, the golden light of the courtroom began to shift, growing dimmer, as if the space itself were inhaling. I felt the pull again, like an invisible hand dragging me forward. I wanted to resist, to stay anchored in the light, but there was no use. The world around me dissolved, and I was plunged back into another memory. This time, it was the kitchen of my childhood home. The faint smell of burnt toast and coffee hung in the air, mingling with the cheap floral scent of my mother's Sunday perfume. She was there, standing at the counter in her pale blue dress, her hair pulled back in a tidy bun. The sight of her hit me like a punch to the gut. She looked younger than I remembered, her face still soft and unlined by the years of tension that had come later. I was there too, 12 years old, sitting at the kitchen table with my arms crossed, glaring at her. The memory was sharp, painfully vivid, as if I were reliving it. I could even hear the faint ticking of the clock on the wall, counting down the seconds of our strained silence. I know it's not fair, my mother said, her voice gentle but firm. But I can't miss the service today. It's important. You always say that. My younger self spat back. Everything is always about church. What about me? Don't I matter? She turned then, her face softening as she looked at me. You matter more than anything, Evelyn. That's why I do this. I'm trying to teach you. You're trying to teach me that I don't matter. I interrupted, my voice rising. That God matters more than I ever will. Her shoulders sagged, the weight of my words sinking in. For a moment, I thought she might cry, but instead, she simply sighed. One day, you'll understand. The scene froze, and I felt the pull again, this time backward, out of the memory. The kitchen faded into nothingness, leaving me standing in the courtroom once more. I felt hollow, the ache of that moment still fresh in my chest. She thought she was teaching you love. The judge's voice resonated through me. But you learned resentment instead. I clenched my fists, my teeth grinding against the tide of emotions threatening to overwhelm me. She abandoned me, I said, my voice trembling. She chose her faith over me, over our family. And yet, the advocate's voice slithered in. You became her. You abandoned your own daughter for a different kind of faith. Not in God, but in control. In your own perfection. No, I shot back, shaking my head. That's not true. Isn't it? The advocate sneered. Shall we see? The courtroom shifted again, faster this time, and I found myself standing outside a bright pink bedroom. My daughter's room. The door was slightly ajar, and I could hear her voice, faint and soft. She was singing to herself, the sweet, off-key tune of a 12-year-old trying to hold on to a moment of joy. I pushed the door open and saw her sitting on the floor, surrounded by scraps of construction paper and markers. She was working on a card, the words, "Happy Birthday, Mom," written in glittering letters across the front. My heart twisted at the sight. I had forgotten about this moment, or maybe I had forced myself to forget. The memory shifted, and I was no longer an observer. I was standing in my kitchen the same night, staring down at that handmade card. My daughter's face was lit with anticipation, her eyes sparkling with hope. She held the card out to me, waiting. "Oh, sweetie," I said, my voice distant even to my own ears. "This is lovely, but I have to finish this case report. Why don't you put it on the fridge?" Her face fell, the light in her eyes dimming. "You don't want to read it?" "Of course I do," I replied, distracted, already turning back to my laptop. "Just not right now." The memory faded, and I was back in the courtroom, the weight of my daughter's disappointment crushing me. My chest felt like it might collapse under the guilt. How had I not seen it then? How had I been so blind? "You chose work over her," the judge said, the voice quieter now but no less powerful. "You chose logic, order, and self preservation. You built walls around yourself, thinking they would protect you, but they only kept out love." "I thought I was doing the right thing," I whispered, my voice cracking. "I thought I was giving her stability." "You gave her absence," the judge replied. The advocate circled me now, its smoky form closing in, suffocating. "You see it now, don't you?" it hissed. "The truth of who you are. You don't deserve redemption. You don't deserve anything." "No," I said, though the word felt fragile. "That's not. I can't." My words faltered as tears streamed down my face. The weight of my failures was unbearable. "Your pain is your penance," the advocate whispered, its voice almost tender now. "Why fight it? Why ask for forgiveness when you know you don't deserve it?" The light in the courtroom dimmed further, and I felt the darkness creeping closer, pressing in on all sides. I thought I might collapse under its weight. But then, faintly, I felt something else. A warmth, small but steady, like the glow of a distant fire. I looked up, and for the first time, I saw my mother standing in the far corner of the courtroom. She wasn't the frail, dying woman from the hospital or the younger mother from the kitchen. She was radiant, whole, her face soft with a love that I didn't deserve but couldn't deny. She reached out a hand to me, her eyes filled with something I couldn't name. "Evelyn," she said, her voice gentle. "It's not too late." The darkness recoiled slightly at her words, but the advocate growled, its form growing more chaotic. "Don't listen to her," it hissed. "She can't save you. No one can." I stared at her hand, trembling with the weight of the decision. I didn't know if I had the strength to take it, but I knew this moment would change everything. Her hand was steady, even as mine shook violently. I stared at it, unsure whether I could reach out. Everything in me screamed to retreat, to protect myself, to avoid whatever was coming. And yet, there she stood, my mother, looking at me with a love I hadn't felt or deserved in years. Her hand didn't waver. The warmth radiating from her was palpable, a stark contrast to the cold, suffocating presence of the advocate circling me. The advocate's voice slithered into my ears again, sharp and cutting. "You can't undo this, Evelyn. Don't let her fool you. She's not here to save you. She's here to watch you fail, just like you failed her." I flinched at the words, my body tensing. Every part of me wanted to lash out, to tell the advocate to shut up, but deep down, I knew it wasn't entirely wrong. I had failed her. I'd failed everyone. My mother, my daughter, my patients, even myself. What right did I have to take her hand, to hope for anything other than the judgment I deserved? But then I saw her eyes. They were soft and filled with something I couldn't quite name. Forgiveness? No, it was more than that. Grace. A grace that I didn't understand, didn't think I could ever deserve, but that was being offered to me all the same. My chest tightened as I reached out, trembling, and placed my hand in hers. The moment our hands touched, the courtroom dissolved, replaced by a wave of light so overwhelming that I staggered. My mother's presence was still there, grounding me, steadying me, even as the light grew brighter. It wasn't harsh or blinding, but warm, enveloping me in a way that felt foreign and yet familiar, like returning to a place I hadn't realized was home. The advocate's voice echoed faintly in the distance, furious and desperate. "This changes nothing, Evelyn. Nothing." But for the first time, I felt the weight of its words lift. The darkness didn't press as tightly against me, and the chill in my soul began to thaw. My mother's hand squeezed mine gently, and I turned to look at her. She wasn't speaking, but her presence told me everything I needed to know. I wasn't alone. The light shifted again, and I found myself standing in the middle of a field. The grass was tall and golden, swaying in a breeze that carried the scent of something sweet, like honeysuckle and summer rain. The sky above was vast and impossibly blue, dotted with clouds that moved lazily across the horizon. It was beautiful, peaceful, but I knew this wasn't the end. There was something I still had to face. My mother stood beside me, no longer holding my hand, but close enough that I could feel her presence. "Where are we?" I asked, my voice quiet, almost reverent. "This is where you begin to see," she said simply, her voice carrying the same warmth as the light around us. I opened my mouth to ask what she meant, but before I could, the field began to change. The golden grass dimmed, the sky darkened, and the air grew heavy. Shadows crept in at the edges of my vision, coalescing into shapes, people. I turned to face them, and my stomach clenched as I recognized the first figure. It was the woman from the hospital, the one who had begged me to call a chaplain for her dying father. Her face was pale, her eyes red and swollen from tears. She was staring at me, her expression not angry but hollow, as though I had taken something from her that she could never get back. Behind her stood her brother, his shoulders slumped under the weight of his grief. I wanted to speak, to apologize, but the words caught in my throat. What could I possibly say that would make up for what I'd done or failed to do? As I watched, the scene shifted, and I saw her again, this time sitting alone in a pew at a church. Her face was still etched with grief, but her hands were clasped tightly in prayer. A small flicker of hope shone in her eyes, and I realized that despite my failure, she had found solace elsewhere. "She forgave you," my mother said softly, as though reading my thoughts. "But that doesn't mean your choice didn't matter." I swallowed hard, tears stinging my eyes. "I didn't mean to hurt her," I whispered. I thought. I thought I was doing the right thing." "You thought you knew better," my mother said gently. "But there are things you can't control, Evelyn. Things you can't fix with logic alone." The shadows shifted again, forming another figure. This time, it was my daughter. She looked younger than she had in years, maybe 9 or 10, sitting at the kitchen table with her art supplies spread out before her. I watched as she worked diligently on a card, her tongue poking out slightly in concentration. My chest tightened as I realized what she was making, a birthday card for me. The memory shifted, and I saw myself walk into the room, exhausted from a long day at the hospital. She handed me the card, her face lit with excitement, and I barely glanced at it before muttering something about being too tired. Her face fell, her shoulders sagged, and she quietly placed the card on the counter before retreating to her room. The scene shattered me. I fell to my knees, the weight of her disappointment pressing down on me like a physical force. I didn't mean to push her away, I choked out. I thought I was doing what was best for her. "She needed you," my mother said, her voice calm but firm. "Not your success, not your achievements. She needed you." The realization hit me like a tidal wave, washing over me with equal parts pain and clarity. I had spent my entire life chasing perfection, control, and logic, thinking that it would make me worthy, that it would protect me from failure. But in doing so, I had lost sight of the people who mattered most. "I failed her," I whispered, my voice breaking. "I failed all of them." My mother knelt beside me, her hand resting on my shoulder. "You did," she said, her words gentle but unflinching. "But failure doesn't have to be the end. You can still choose differently." I looked up at her, my tears blurring her face. "How? How do I fix this?" "You start by accepting the grace you've been running from," she said. "You let go of the need to control everything and trust that love is enough." The words settled over me like a balm, soothing the raw ache in my chest. For the first time, I felt the faint stirrings of hope, fragile but real. The shadows around me began to fade, and the golden field returned, brighter and more vivid than before. My mother smiled, her face radiant. "This is only the beginning," she said. "But you have to choose." I nodded, the weight in my chest lifting slightly. I didn't know what lay ahead, but for the first time, I felt ready to face it. The golden field stretched out around me, vast and endless, but I couldn't shake the weight of the choice ahead. My mother stood beside me, patient and steady, her presence grounding me even as my thoughts churned. Her words still lingered in the air. "You have to choose." The idea both terrified and intrigued me. I wasn't ready to admit it yet, but deep down, I knew this wasn't just about the people I had hurt. It was about the kind of person I had allowed myself to become. The field began to shift again, the warmth of the golden light dimming. I tensed, unsure of what was coming next. The air grew colder, sharper, as though it carried the weight of a storm. Slowly, a mountain emerged in the distance, its jagged peaks cutting into the sky like the edge of a blade. A narrow path wound its way up the mountain, steep and treacherous, disappearing into the clouds. My mother turned to me, her expression serious now. "This is your test," she said. "The path ahead is not easy, but it is necessary." "What's at the top?" I asked, though I wasn't sure I wanted to know. She gave me a faint, knowing smile. "You'll find what you need." Her answer wasn't exactly comforting, but there was no point in arguing. I looked down at the path, my stomach knotting at the sight of its sheer cliffs and uneven terrain. It felt impossible, but staying here wasn't an option either. The golden light was already fading, and the shadows were creeping closer again. I took a deep breath and stepped forward. The first few steps felt tentative, like my legs might give out beneath me, but the ground held. I kept moving, one foot in front of the other, the path winding upward. The higher I climbed, the thinner the air became, each breath burning in my lungs. The cold bit into my skin, and the wind howled around me, threatening to knock me off balance. It didn't take long for the doubts to creep in. Every step felt harder than the last, and the summit seemed no closer than when I'd started. I stopped for a moment, leaning against a jagged rock, and the advocate's voice slithered back into my mind. "You think this is going to change anything?" It hissed. "You think you can undo years of failure with one climb? Face it, Evelyn. You're wasting your time." I clenched my teeth, trying to shut out the voice, but it was relentless. "You don't belong here," it continued, its tone mocking. "You don't deserve forgiveness, and you never will." "I don't care what you think," I muttered, though my voice shook. "I'm not doing this for you." The advocate laughed, a harsh, grating sound. "Then who are you doing it for? Your mother? Your daughter? Yourself? Be honest, Evelyn. You don't even know why you're climbing." Its words struck a nerve, and I stumbled slightly, my foot slipping on the loose gravel. The wind howled louder, and for a moment, I thought I might fall. But then I remembered my mother's face, the way she had looked at me with a love that defied all logic or reason. I thought of my daughter, of the way her eyes had lit up when she handed me that birthday card, so full of hope. I couldn't let that light go out, not again. I pushed forward, each step feeling heavier than the last. The path narrowed as I climbed, the cliffs on either side dropping into a darkness that seemed to stretch forever. My legs burned, my lungs ached, and the cold seeped into my bones. But I kept going. I didn't have a choice. At one point, the path seemed to disappear entirely, replaced by a chasm too wide to cross. I stood at the edge, staring down into the abyss, my heart pounding. There was no bridge, no visible way forward. I looked back over my shoulder, half expecting to see my mother, but the path behind me was empty. "Great," I muttered to myself. "Now what?" The advocate's voice returned, low and venomous. "Turn back," it said. "You've gone far enough. No one would blame you. This isn't worth it." I shook my head, trying to drown it out. "No," I said, louder this time. "I'm not stopping." "But there's nothing ahead," it sneered. "Just more pain, more struggle. You're wasting your energy." I ignored it, scanning the chasm for any sign of a way across. That's when I saw it, a faint, almost imperceptible glow on the other side. It wasn't much, just a flicker of light, but it was enough. I didn't know how I was going to get there, but I knew I couldn't give up. I took a step back, bracing myself, and then I ran. The wind roared in my ears as I leapt, the ground disappearing beneath me. For a moment, I was weightless, suspended in the air, and then I hit the other side. My knees buckled, and I collapsed onto the rocky ground, gasping for breath. The advocate's voice was quiet now, almost sulking. Lucky, it muttered, but I didn't respond. I didn't need to. I pulled myself to my feet and kept climbing. The path grew steeper, the air thinner, but I didn't stop. I couldn't stop. Each step felt like a small victory, a defiance of the doubts and fears that had plagued me for so long. Finally, I reached the summit. The wind died down, and the air grew still. The clouds parted, revealing a view that took my breath away. The golden light was back, brighter and more vivid than ever, stretching across the horizon like a sunrise. In the center of it stood a figure, radiant and unshakable. I knew who it was before they even spoke. The presence I had felt in the courtroom, the one that had weighed so heavily on me, it was here, fully realized. I fell to my knees, tears streaming down my face. The figure didn't say anything at first, but its presence was enough. I felt the weight of everything I had carried, my guilt, my failures, my fears, begin to lift. It wasn't gone. Not completely, but it was lighter, more manageable. Evelyn, the figure said finally, its voice like a warm embrace. You've come far. I nodded, my throat too tight to speak. I didn't know what was going to happen next, but for the first time in a long time, I wasn't afraid. The figure stood before me, radiant and overwhelming, and yet I didn't feel fear. I had expected to tremble, to shrink beneath the weight of its presence, but instead, I felt warmth, like the first rays of the sun after a long, cold night. It wasn't just the light that surrounded them, it was a feeling, something I couldn't put into words. Peace, love, forgiveness, all of it wrapped around me, cradling me in a way that left me undone. I tried to speak, to explain, to justify, but the words tangled in my throat. What could I say? That I didn't mean to hurt the people I loved? That I was trying to do my best? Even in the glow of this presence, those excuses felt hollow. So instead, I fell to my knees and wept. The tears came fast and hard, a flood of regret and shame spilling out of me. I wasn't just crying for the things I had done wrong, I was crying for all the things I'd never done. The moments I'd let slip by, the love I'd withheld, the walls I'd built between myself and the people who had tried to reach me. The figure stepped closer, their light softening as they knelt beside me. I felt a hand on my shoulder, not heavy, not condemning, but steady. They didn't speak right away, letting me cry until the tide began to ebb, until I could breathe again. When I finally looked up, their face was clearer now, not in a physical sense, but in a way that made me feel like they had always been there. Watching, waiting. Evelyn, they said, their voice low and calm. You've carried so much for so long. It's time to lay it down. I wanted to protest, to explain that I didn't know how, but they held up a hand, and the words died in my throat. You think you have to fix it all, they continued. That every mistake, every failure is yours alone to bear. But that's not true. I don't know how to let it go, I whispered, my voice trembling. I don't know how to fix what I've done. They smiled, a smile so gentle, so full of love, that it brought fresh tears to my eyes. You've already taken the first step. You've seen the truth, and you've chosen to keep climbing, even when it hurt. That is enough for now. The ground beneath us shifted, and suddenly, we were standing in my kitchen. The scene was achingly familiar. My daughter sat at the table, crayons and paper scattered in front of her as she worked on another card. I watched myself walk into the room, still in my hospital scrubs, exhaustion etched into my face. I saw her look up, hope lighting her eyes as she held the card out to me, only for my past self to wave her off, too tired to notice the way her shoulders slumped when I turned away. The figure beside me didn't say anything, but I didn't need them to. I already knew what they were going to ask. I want to go back, I said, my voice breaking. I want to fix this. They nodded. their expression both kind and firm. You can't change the past, Evelyn, but you can choose differently going forward. The scene shifted again, and I was back in the hospital, standing outside the ICU. The family from before was there, the young woman crying softly into her brother's shoulder as they waited for news of their father. I watched as my past self walked past them, cold and detached, offering only clinical explanations when what they needed was something more. They found comfort elsewhere, the figure said gently. But you could have been a part of that moment. You could have been a light when they needed it most. I see that now, I said, my chest tightening. I didn't understand before, but I do now. I want to do better. Then you will, they said simply. But it won't be easy. Choosing love, choosing grace, it requires effort. It requires faith. Are you willing to walk that path? I nodded, the weight in my chest lifting slightly. I am. The light around us grew brighter, and I felt the world begin to tilt, the air around me shifting like a current pulling me in another direction. The figure reached out, placing a hand over my heart, and I felt a warmth spread through me, chasing away the last vestiges of darkness. This is not the end, Evelyn, they said. It's a new beginning. The light consumed me, and for a moment, there was nothing but warmth and peace. Then slowly the sensation changed. I felt heavy again, my body aching as though I'd been pulled from deep water. A sharp pain flared in my chest, and I gasped, the air flooding my lungs like fire. My eyes fluttered open, and I was greeted by the harsh fluorescent lights of the hospital ceiling. Evelyn, she's back, a voice called, distant but growing clearer. I turned my head slightly and saw the faces of the paramedics hovering over me, their expressions a mix of relief and urgency. My body felt broken, every limb screaming in protest as they lifted me onto a stretcher, but my heart felt different, lighter. The ride to the hospital was a blur, a haze of pain and noise, but through it all, I held on to the memory of that light, that warmth. I didn't know what was going to happen next, but I knew one thing for certain. I had been given another chance. In the days that followed, as I recovered from the crash, I began to put that chance into action. I reached out to my daughter first, calling her from my hospital bed and apologizing for every missed birthday, every forgotten moment. She cried, and so did I, but it was the start of something new. I promised her that things would be different, and for the first time, I meant it. I returned to work with a different mindset, one that wasn't focused solely on saving lives, but on connecting with the people I served. I started listening not just to symptoms, but to stories. When a patient's family asked for a chaplain, I called one without hesitation. When my colleagues looked tired or overwhelmed, I stopped to ask if they were okay. It wasn't perfect. I wasn't perfect, but I didn't have to be. The figure's words stayed with me. Choosing love requires effort. It requires faith. And every day I chose to try. The advocate's voice still lingered sometimes, whispering doubts and fears, but its hold on me had weakened. I knew now that I wasn't walking this path alone. The light I had felt on that mountain, the presence of grace, it was with me still, guiding me forward, one step at a time.